A successful millionaire secretly decides to shelter a homeless little girl in the basement of his mansion. He fears that his wife, an arrogant and ruthless woman, will discover his secret. What happens in the next few days will surprise you. The rain pounded mercilessly against the windows of Richard Sterling's luxury car as he made his way home from another successful charity gala. His thoughts drifted to the mountains of paperwork awaiting him at his office tomorrow. Another series of business acquisitions that had made him one of the most powerful men in the city. The windshield wipers worked frantically to clear his view of the deserted streets, and that's when he saw her. A small figure huddled in the doorway of an abandoned storefront, her thin frame shaking visibly even from a distance. Richard's foot instinctively pressed the brake, his car coming to a gentle stop. He shouldn't get involved, he told himself. His wife Victoria would never approve. She was adamant about maintaining their pristine public image, and picking up street children wasn't part of that carefully curated persona. But something about the girl's posture, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, stirred something deep within him. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe a long-buried memory of his own humble beginnings. Before he could talk himself out of it, Richard stepped out into the rain. As he approached, the girl looked up and their eyes met. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but her gaze held a wisdom far beyond her years. Her clothes were worn and soaked through, but she didn't beg or reach out for help. Instead, she watched him warily, as if trying to determine his intentions. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Richard said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Where are your parents?" The girl's silence spoke volumes. Richard noticed her hands were clutching a worn photograph, protected from the rain beneath her threadbare jacket. Something about her demeanor reminded him of someone, but he couldn't quite place it. "I'm Richard," he continued, crouching down to her level. "Would you like to come somewhere warm and dry?" She studied him for a long moment before speaking, her voice surprisingly clear and articulate. "I'm Sophie," she said, "and I don't trust strangers with big houses and bigger secrets." Richard felt as if he'd been physically struck. How could this child possibly know anything about his life? But before he could question her further, a violent shiver racked her small frame, and his protective instincts took over. "Listen, Sophie," he said, removing his suit jacket and draping it over her shoulders. "I have a proposition for you. My house has a basement apartment, warm, private, and safe. You can stay there while we figure out how to help you, but—" He hesitated, knowing what he was about to suggest was wrong on many levels. "You'll need to remain hidden. My wife, she's complicated. She wouldn't understand." Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question, one Richard wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because sometimes doing the right thing means breaking your own rules," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie nodded slowly. "I'll come with you," she said, "but I have conditions of my own." Richard couldn't help but smile at her boldness. "And what might those be?" "I need access to your library," she said without hesitation, "and I want to learn. Everything you can teach me about business, about how people like you become so powerful." The request was unexpected, and something about her intensity made Richard uncomfortable. But what harm could come from teaching a child about business? "Deal," he said, extending his hand. Sophie took it, her small fingers surprisingly warm despite the cold. As they walked to his car, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this simple act of charity would change his life forever. What he didn't realize was that Sophie had already begun implementing a plan of her own, one that would unravel the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life. As they drove through the gates of his estate, Richard glanced in his rearview mirror. Sophie sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the massive house looming before them. In her hands, the photograph she'd been protecting was now carefully tucked away, but Richard caught a glimpse of what looked like a familiar corporate logo in the corner. "We'll enter through the service entrance," Richard explained, parking in a secluded area of the garage. "Mrs. Rodriguez, our housekeeper, will help get you settled. She's trustworthy and discreet. You'll have everything you need, but remember our agreement. Absolute secrecy, is essential. Sophie nodded, but her attention was elsewhere, taking in every detail of her surroundings with an intensity that seemed almost professional. As they made their way to the basement apartment, Richard couldn't help but wonder if he'd just invited a ghost from his past into his home, or if the guilt of his success was finally manifesting in paranoid thoughts. Victoria Sterling's perfectly manicured nails drummed against her mahogany desk as she reviewed the latest social calendar. The annual charity gala was approaching, and everything had to be flawless. She paused, her attention drawn to unusual sounds echoing through the mansions. Ventilation system. Childish laughter, perhaps. No, that was impossible. She'd forbidden children from the premises years ago after. She shook her head, dispelling the memory. The house was playing tricks on her again, as it often did. Victoria stood, smoothing her designer dress, and walked to the window overlooking the manicured gardens. Everything in her view was meticulously maintained, controlled just as she preferred. Yet lately, small disruptions had been creeping into her ordered world. The first sign had been Richard's changed behavior. Her husband had always been predictable, spending his evenings in his study with his business papers, but now he was frequently absent, making excuses about checking the wine cellar or organizing the basement storage. Victoria might have been concerned about an affair except for the other oddities, missing food from the kitchen, children's books disappearing from the library, and most peculiarly, the sound of a child's voice floating through the vents. Mrs. Rodriguez, their usually impeccable housekeeper, had been acting strangely as well. Victoria had caught her carrying extra meals to the basement, only to claim they were for herself. The woman had never eaten in the basement before, preferring the sunny kitchen with its garden view. "Mrs. Sterling," Mrs. Rodriguez's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Your tea is ready." Victoria turned to face the housekeeper, studying her with careful eyes. "Thank you, Maria. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual lately? About Richard?" The housekeeper's face remained carefully neutral. "Unusual, ma'am? No, everything seems normal to me." "Really? Not even the extra food that's been disappearing from the kitchen?" A flicker of something, worry, fear, crossed Mrs. Rodriguez's face before she composed herself. "I've been taking some extra portions home to my grandchildren, ma'am. I should have asked permission." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "You've worked for us for 15 years, Maria. You don't need permission for such things." She paused, watching the older woman's reaction. "Though I do find it interesting that you've never mentioned having grandchildren before." Mrs. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "They're recent additions to the family, ma'am." "I see." Victoria's tone made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. "And I suppose these grandchildren also enjoy reading the classics?" "Several books have gone missing from the library." "I wouldn't know about that, ma'am." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the tea service. Victoria sipped her tea thoughtfully, watching as the housekeeper hurried from the room. Once alone, she moved to her computer and pulled up the security camera feeds. Richard had insisted on keeping the basement cameras disconnected for privacy, claiming he needed a space free from surveillance to think. She'd allowed it, seeing no harm in the request at the time. Now, however, that decision felt like an oversight. That needed correction. Victoria opened her desk drawer and removed a small device, a portable microphone detector she'd purchased years ago during a particularly paranoid phase of their marriage. Perhaps it was time to put it to use. As she contemplated her next move, a sheet of paper fluttered from beneath her calendar. A child's drawing, done in crayon. It showed a big house with 3 figures, a tall man, a woman with long dark hair, and a small girl. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen this drawing in years, not since the sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped her back to the present. She quickly tucked the drawing away, her heart racing. Richard appeared in the doorway, looking somewhat disheveled. "Victoria, darling, I'll be working late in the basement tonight. Don't wait up." She smiled sweetly, years of practice making. The expression appeared genuine. "Of course, dear, don't work too hard." As Richard's footsteps faded away, Victoria made her decision. Tonight, she would uncover whatever secret her husband was keeping in the basement. But first, she needed to make a phone call to an old friend who specialized in finding information people preferred to keep hidden. Sophie's fingers traced the spines of leather-bound books in Richard's basement library, her small frame illuminated by the warm glow of antique lamps. After 2 weeks in her hidden sanctuary, she had already memorized the layout of every room, every secret passage, and every creaking floorboard. The basement was becoming less of a prison and more of a treasure trove of information. Mrs. Rodriguez had become her silent ally, bringing not only food but also additional books Sophie requested. Today's selection included volumes on corporate finance and business acquisitions, unusual reading material for a 7-year-old, but Sophie was far from ordinary. A sound from above made her freeze. Victoria Sterling's distinctive heels clicked across the marble floor of the main level. Sophie held her breath, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of light streaming through a ventilation grate. The footsteps paused directly overhead. "I know you're here," Victoria's voice drifted down, though she seemed to be talking to herself. "Whatever you are, whoever you are, I will find you." Sophie retreated to her designated living space, but not before grabbing a particular folder she'd discovered hidden behind the accounting books. Inside were documents detailing the Sterling Corporation's earliest days, including the acquisition of a small family-owned bookstore 15 years ago. Sophie's fingers trembled as she studied the photograph paperclipped to the file. A woman with kind eyes stood in front of the shop, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. The basement door creaked open, and Sophie quickly hid the folder under her mattress. Richard descended the stairs, looking more tired than usual. "How are you settling in?" he asked, attempting to sound casual despite the worry lines creasing his forehead. "Your wife suspects something," Sophie stated matter-of-factly, watching his reaction. Richard sank into an armchair, loosening his tie. "Victoria has always been perceptive, but she's also rational. As long as we're careful, she'll eventually dismiss her suspicions. Like she dismissed what happened to Emma's bookshop." Sophie's question hung in the air like a thundercloud. The color drained from Richard's face. "Where did you hear that? Name?" "I read," Sophie replied simply, gesturing to the library, "and I remember things. The woman in the yellow dress who used to own the bookshop, she had a daughter, a baby girl." Richard stood abruptly, his hands shaking. "Sophie, there are things you don't understand. Complicated things about business, about necessity." "I understand more than you think," Sophie interrupted, pulling out a worn photograph. From her pocket, the same one she'd been clutching the night Richard found her. It showed the same woman from the business file, only years later, her kind eyes now filled with sadness. Before Richard could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by Victoria's voice calling his name. Sophie quickly returned to her hiding spot as Richard hurried up the stairs, his mind racing with questions about how much this mysterious child really knew. Upstairs, Victoria stood in Richard's study, surrounded by scattered papers. She held an old newspaper clipping in her trembling hands. "Richard, darling," her voice dripped with forced sweetness, "would you care to explain why I found business documents hidden in the basement ventilation system, and why they all seem to concern Emma Richardson's old bookstore?" Richard's carefully constructed world began to crack. Behind him, through the open study door, he caught a glimpse of Mrs. Rodriguez hurrying past, carrying what looked suspiciously like a child's drawing. The web of secrets he'd woven was beginning to unravel, strand by careful strand. Victoria Sterling had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, but as she stood in Richard's study, surrounded by evidence of long-buried secrets, she felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. The newspaper clipping in her hands featured a familiar storefront, Emma's bookshop, and a headline announcing its closure 15 years ago. "It's not what you think," Richard began, but Victoria cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Really? Because I think you've been hiding something significant from me. First the suspicious behavior, then the sounds from the basement, and now these documents about Emma Richardson's shop. The same Emma who used to be my best friend before she mysteriously disappeared." A floorboard creaked behind them, and both turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez hovering in the doorway, her usually composed face etched with concern. "Mrs. Sterling, perhaps you should sit down. There's something you need to know." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she noticed what the housekeeper was holding, a child's drawing, fresh and new, not yellowed with age. "What is that, Maria?" Before Mrs. Rodriguez could respond, a small voice spoke from the shadows of the hallway. "It's mine." Sophie stepped into view, her chin raised defiantly despite her trembling hands. "I drew it." Victoria staggered backward, gripping the edge of Richard's desk for support. The girl's features, illuminated by the study's warm lighting, stirred something deep in her memory. Those eyes. They were Emma's eyes. "Richard," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is she?" But it was Sophie who answered, stepping fully into the room. "My name is Sophie Richardson. Emma Richardson was my mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's gaze darted between the girl and the newspaper clipping, connecting dots she'd been too blind, or too afraid to see before. "Emma's baby. But she told me she lost—" "She didn't lose anything," Sophie stated firmly. "Things were taken from her. Her bookstore, her home, her dreams, all gone because of business decisions made in this very room." Richard sank into his leather chair, his face ashen. "Victoria, I can explain everything. The acquisition of Emma's bookshop was necessary for the development project. We offered fair compensation." "Fair?" Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. "Is that what you call it when you force someone to sell their family legacy? When you use legal loopholes to pressure small business owners into accepting whatever you offer?" Victoria raised a hand to silence them both, her mind racing. "Where is Emma now?" she demanded. Sophie's expression softened slightly. "She's in Arizona, working at a small library. She rebuilt her life, but she never forgot what happened here. She never forgot her best friend who stopped returning her calls after the acquisition." The accusation in Sophie's voice hit Victoria like a physical blow. She remembered ignoring Emma's increasingly desperate attempts to contact her, convinced by Richard that maintaining professional distance was necessary for their social position. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Perhaps it's time for everyone to sit down and talk honestly. There are more stories here than anyone realizes." Victoria looked at the drawing in Mrs. Rodriguez's hand, a simple sketch of 3 figures in front of a house. But it wasn't just any house, it was an exact replica of Emma's old bookshop. The same bookshop where Victoria had spent countless afternoons with her friend, dreaming of their futures while surrounded by the scent of old books and possibility. "You've been helping her," Victoria said to Mrs. Rodriguez, realization dawning. "All this time, the extra food, the missing books." The housekeeper nodded. "Sometimes, Mrs. Sterling, doing the right thing means choosing between loyalty to our employers and loyalty to our conscience." As the truth settled over the room like fine dust, each person lost in their own thoughts, a new sound broke the tension. The doorbell. Victoria watched as Richard's face went pale. "That would be Mr. Chen," she said calmly. "I invited him to discuss some old business records I discovered. I believe he was Emma's lawyer during the acquisition." Mr. Chen's arrival created a ripple effect through the Sterling mansion. The distinguished lawyer sat in Victoria's private sitting room, his weathered briefcase containing 15 years of carefully preserved documents. Sophie, now seated between Mrs. Rodriguez and Richard, watched. As Victoria paced the elegant room, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet. "Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Chen began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I've kept these records all these years because something about the Emma's bookshop acquisition never sat right with me. The timing, the pressure tactics, the sudden withdrawal of other potential buyers. It seemed orchestrated." Victoria paused her pacing, turning to face her husband. "Richard, you promised me that acquisition was clean. You said Emma agreed to sell willingly." "Technically, she did," Richard responded, loosening his collar. "We followed every legal procedure." "But you didn't tell me about the other part," Victoria interrupted. "About using your connections to discourage other buyers. About threatening to build a massive retail complex next door if she didn't sell. About using my friendship with her as leverage. Sophie pulled out her worn photograph, handling it with reverence. Mum used to say the hardest part wasn't losing the bookstore, it was losing her best friend. She kept hoping you'd call, Victoria. Even years later she'd check her phone, thinking maybe today would be the day you'd remember your promise. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. What promise? The one you made in the secret room above the bookshop. You said no matter what happened, you'd always be sisters. That nothing, not even marriage or money, would come between you. The color drained from Victoria's face as the memory surfaced. The secret room had been their sanctuary during college years, a hidden space accessed through a trap door in the bookshop's ceiling. They'd spent countless hours there, sharing dreams and making plans for the future. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the matter at hand. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Sterling. The property wasn't just a bookshop, it was designated as a historical landmark, but that designation mysteriously disappeared from city records just before the acquisition. Richard stood, abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's enough. What's done is done. We can't change the past. No, Victoria said softly, but we can correct our mistakes. She turned to Sophie, really looking at the girl for the first time. You have your mother's eyes and her spirit. Coming here, facing us, that took incredible courage. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Sophie's hand supportively as the girl spoke. I didn't come for revenge. I came because Mom deserves to know the truth. She deserves to understand why her best friend abandoned her when she needed her most. Victoria moved to the window, watching as the setting sun painted the mansion's gardens in shades of gold and shadow. The perfectly manicured landscape suddenly seemed sterile compared to the wild, beautiful garden Emma had maintained behind her bookshop. Richard, she said, her voice taking on a new strength, I want you to call the board. Emergency meeting. First thing tomorrow morning. She turned to face the room, her decision evident in her posture. It's time we made things right. Mr. Chen began pulling more documents from his briefcase, but Victoria raised a hand to stop him. Those won't be necessary yet. First, I need to make a phone call, one that's 15 years overdue. As Victoria reached for her phone, Sophie pulled something else from her pocket, a small worn key with a brass bookshop logo. Mum said to give you this if I ever found you. She never changed the locks to the secret room. The key glinted. In the fading sunlight, a small object that held the weight of countless memories and unspoken words. Victoria took it with trembling fingers, recognition flooding her features. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of the Sterling mansion seemed to become transparent, revealing the true nature of its inhabitants, not the powerful business moguls they pretended to be, but flawed, human souls capable of both. Great error and profound redemption. The phone rang 5 times before Emma Richardson answered. Victoria's heart pounded as she heard the familiar voice, older, perhaps more guarded, but still unmistakably Emma. Hello? Victoria's carefully prepared speech evaporated. Instead, she whispered, I still have the key to our secret room. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice thick with emotion. Sophie, found you. She's remarkable, Emma, just like her mother. Victoria glanced at Sophie, who was now curled up in an armchair, pretending not to listen while devouring every word. She's also incredibly brave and far too wise for her years. She gets that from her father, Emma replied softly. He always said knowledge was the greatest form of courage. Victoria's hand tightened around the phone. Emma, I need to tell you something. About the bookshop. About everything that happened. Not over the phone, Emma interrupted. Some conversations need to happen face to face. Richard, who had been watching the exchange with growing anxiety, stepped forward. Emma, this is Richard. I'd like to offer to fly you here immediately. My private jet is at your disposal. Another long pause followed. The Richard Sterling I knew would never admit to being wrong, let alone offer his private jet to fix a mistake. The Richard Sterling you knew has learned some hard lessons recently, he replied, looking at Sophie, thanks to a very persistent young lady. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Ms. Richardson, please come. There are many hearts here that need healing and many wrongs that need to be set right. Emma's soft laugh carried through the speaker, Maria, you're still there, keeping everyone in line. Someone has to, Senora, Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Some things never change. As arrangements were made for Emma's arrival, Sophie slipped away to the basement, returning with a stack of papers, her discoveries from weeks of research in Richard's library. She placed them on Victoria's desk. Old photographs, business, records and something else, a series of letters Emma had written to Victoria over the years, all returned unopened. Victoria picked up the first letter, its seal still intact. How did you get these? They were in a box marked personal correspondence in the basement, Sophie explained, along with these. She pulled out another bundle, letters Victoria had written to Emma but never sent, each one expressing regret, confusion and longing for their lost friendship. Mr. Chen, who had been taking notes throughout the evening, cleared his throat. Mrs. Sterling, there's still the matter of the historical landmark status. The documentation I've gathered suggests we're not just restoring a building, Victoria interrupted, her eyes fixed on the letters. We're restoring something far more precious. She turned to Richard, her expression resolute. The development project on the old bookshop site, I want it stopped immediately. Richard nodded, already reaching for his phone. I'll have legal draw up the paperwork first thing tomorrow. As the adults discussed logistics, Sophie retrieved one final item from her basement sanctuary, a leather-bound book with a familiar title, The Secret Garden. It was the same copy Victoria and Emma had read together in their hidden room, their teenage notes still scribbled in the margins. Mom reads this to me every night, Sophie said, offering the book to Victoria. She says it's about how love can bring dead things back to life. Victoria accepted the book, her fingers tracing the worn spine. Your mother always did have a gift for finding hope in unexpected places. She looked around the room, at Richard's chastened expression, Mrs. Rodriguez's knowing smile, Mr. Chen's careful documentation of redemption in progress, and most importantly, at Sophie's determined young face. The mansion's imposing walls seemed to soften in the gathering dusk, as if the building itself was exhaling years of held secrets. Tomorrow, Emma would arrive, and the real work of healing would begin. But tonight, in this moment, the first bridges were being built across the chasms of time and regret. Victoria opened the book to a random page, smiling at a note written in Emma's distinctive handwriting. Sometimes, the longest journey is the one that leads us back home. The morning Emma Richardson was scheduled to arrive, Victoria found herself in front of the old bookshop building. The once vibrant storefront stood quiet, its windows covered with years of abandonment. The brass key felt heavy in her pocket as she approached the side entrance, the one that had always been their secret way in. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Victoria climbed the narrow stairs, her designer heels echoing in the empty space. The trapdoor to their secret room was exactly where she remembered, and as she pushed it open, 15 years of memories flooded back. The room was untouched, their old beanbags, now dusty, still arranged around a small table. Book club schedules yellowed on the wall, and their shared journal lay open on a shelf preserved like a time capsule. Victoria picked up the journal, reading their last entry. Best friends forever, no matter what life throws our way. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Emma's plane had landed. At the Sterling mansion, Sophie paced the foyer nervously, straightening her dress for the 100th time. Mrs. Rodriguez had helped her choose it, a simple blue sundress that reminded her of the one her mother wore in old photographs. She's here, Richard announced, watching a sleek black car approach through the security cameras. The front door opened, and Emma Richardson stepped into the mansion. She wore a librarian's practical clothing, her hair streaked with subtle gray, but her eyes were as bright and determined as ever. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the opulent surroundings that had once intimidated her. "Mom!" Sophie rushed forward, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Emma held her daughter tight, whispering, "You clever, brave girl. You actually did it." Richard stepped forward awkwardly. "Emma, Not yet," Emma interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "Where's Victoria?" As if on cue, Victoria appeared in the doorway, clutching their old journal. The two women stared at each other, decades of unspoken words hanging between them. "I went to the bookshop," Victoria said, softly. "Everything's still there in our room, even this." She held out the journal. Emma took a step forward, then another, until she stood directly in front of her former best friend. "You kept your key all these years?" "I couldn't throw it away," Victoria admitted. "Just like I couldn't send those letters I wrote you, or stop thinking about you every time I passed the building." Sophie watched the exchange with growing hope, while Richard hung back, his usual confidence replaced by genuine remorse. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a tea service, setting it up in the sunroom, where morning light streamed through floor to ceiling. "Windows. Perhaps," the housekeeper suggested gently, "you would all be more comfortable sitting down. Some conversations are easier with a cup of tea." As they settled into the sunroom, Emma pulled out a familiar-looking envelope. "I brought something too," she said, placing it on the table. "The original offer you made for the bookshop, Richard, the one before you started playing hardball." Richard's face paled. "Emma, I'm not here for revenge," Emma interrupted. "I'm here because my daughter believed enough in the power of truth to orchestrate this whole reunion. And because somewhere under all this marble and money, I believe my best friend is still there." Victoria reached across the table, taking Emma's hand. "She is. She's been here all along, suffocating under years of pretense and social obligations." "The bookshop's historical status," Mr. Chen interjected from the doorway, where he had appeared with more documents. "It can be reinstated. I've already begun the paperwork." Emma shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "The building isn't what matters. It's what it represented. Friendship, dreams, trust. Those are the things that need to be restored." Sophie, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mom always says that stories have power. That's why she became a librarian. To keep sharing stories with people who need them." Victoria squeezed Emma's hand tighter. "Then perhaps it's time we wrote a new story. Together." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Sterling mansion's windows as Emma and Victoria sat in their old secret room above the bookshop. They'd excused themselves from the others, needing this private moment to bridge 15 years of silence. "I named her Sophie Victoria," Emma said quietly, running her fingers along the spines of dusty books. "Even after everything, I couldn't imagine my daughter not carrying a piece of you." Victoria's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide her tears. "I convinced myself I was protecting you, that keeping my distance during the acquisition was professional courtesy. Richard said a lot of things," Emma interrupted, gently. "But you chose to believe him over 15 years of friendship." Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Sophie sat with Richard in his study, watching him examine old photographs spread across his desk. "You know," he said, "I used to believe success was measured in dollars and acquisitions. Building something bigger always meant someone smaller had to step aside." "And now?" Sophie asked, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. Richard picked up a photo of the bookshop in its prime. "Now I understand that some things once broken can't be fixed with money, but perhaps they can be healed with truth." Mrs. Rodriguez entered with fresh tea, pausing to straighten a frame on the wall, a child's drawing of 3 figures in front of a house. "Senor Sterling," she said, "sometimes the biggest business isn't the one that makes the most money, but the one that makes the most difference." In the bookshop's secret room, Victoria pulled out the stack of unsent letters. "I wrote to you every month that first year. Each time I convinced myself it was too late, that you'd never forgive me." Emma reached into her bag, producing her own collection of correspondence. "I wrote too. Even after my letters came back unopened, I kept writing. Some habits of the heart are hard to break." "How did Sophie know?" Victoria asked. "About the secret room, about our history?" Emma smiled softly. "I read her our old journal every night when she was little, not just the happy parts, all of it. I wanted her to understand that friendship isn't just about the easy moments. It's about choosing to fight for someone, even when they've stopped fighting for themselves." Back at the mansion, Mr. Chen reviewed documents with Richard, pointing out discrepancies and suggesting corrections. The historical status can be restored, he explained. But there's something else. The original trust that owned the building, it was never properly dissolved. Richard looked up sharply. What are you saying? Legally speaking, Emma Richardson still owns 49% of that property. Your acquisition wasn't as complete as you thought. Sophie, who had been pretending to read nearby, smiled behind her book. She'd discovered this detail weeks ago in the basement archives, but had waited for the right moment for it to come to light. As evening approached, Emma and Victoria finally returned to the mansion, their faces showing signs of both tears and laughter. They found Sophie in the garden with Mrs. Rodriguez, planting flowers in a pattern that looked surprisingly familiar. It's like the garden behind the bookshop, Emma realized, recognizing the design. Sophie found an old photograph, Mrs. Rodriguez explained. She said every story needs roots to grow. Victoria looked at her old friend, then at the determined young girl who had orchestrated this reunion. Emma, what if we didn't just restore the bookshop? What if we reimagined it? Richard appeared in the garden doorway, holding Mr. Chen's documents. Actually, there's something you both need to know about the property's ownership. But before he could continue, Sophie spoke up. Mum always says that a good story needs 3 things: truth, courage, and a chance for redemption. I think we have all 3 now. The adults exchanged glances, each recognizing the wisdom in her words. The path forward wouldn't be simple, but with truth finally in the open, healing could begin. As the sun set over the Sterling mansion, its shadows seemed less imposing, its walls more permeable to the possibility of change. The next morning, the Sterling mansion's dining room hosted an unusual breakfast gathering. Emma and Victoria sat side by side, poring over old photographs and building plans, while Sophie meticulously arranged colored sticky notes on a large whiteboard she'd convinced Richard to install. So, Sophie announced, tapping her marker. Against the board, here's what we know. The bookshop is still structurally sound, the historical status can be restored, and technically, Mom still owns almost half of it. Richard, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, set down his cup. I've been thinking about that. The legal complications of the partial ownership actually present an opportunity. For what? Emma asked, her guard slightly raised. For a partnership, he replied, pulling out a folder of freshly drafted documents. Not a corporate takeover, not a buyout, but a true collaboration between equals. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with inspiration. What if we combined the best of both worlds? The charm and community focus of the original bookshop with modern amenities and resources? Mrs. Rodriguez entered with fresh pastries, pausing to study Sophie's elaborate whiteboard. Señorita Sophie has already drawn up quite the business plan, she remarked, pointing to a detailed section labeled Community Integration. The adults turned to look at Sophie's work. The young girl had created a comprehensive vision, a renovated bookshop with a coffee bar, reading nooks, and a dedicated children's section. But what caught everyone's attention was the second-floor plan. The Literary Arts Center, Sophie explained, her voice growing animated. A place where local writers can work, where children can learn to love reading, and where community groups can meet. And above it all, the secret room, Emma and Victoria said in unison, sharing a knowing smile. But this time, Sophie continued, it won't be a secret. It'll be the writer's sanctuary, a special place for people who need somewhere quiet, to create their own stories. Richard studied the plans with growing admiration. You've really thought this through, haven't you? I had 7 weeks in your basement library, Sophie replied with a shrug. I did my homework. Victoria reached for Emma's hand under the table, a gesture reminiscent of their teenage years. What do you think, Em? Ready to be business partners? Emma looked around the table at Richard's genuine desire for redemption, Victoria's rekindled enthusiasm, Mrs. Rodriguez's quiet approval, and her daughter's determined expression. On one condition, she said finally. Name it, Richard responded immediately. The basement of the new building becomes a free literacy center for underprivileged children. No child should feel like they have to hide in a basement to access knowledge. The pointed comment made Richard wince, but he nodded. "I'll establish an endowment to ensure it's properly funded in perpetuity." Sophie added a new section to her whiteboard, the Foundation for Literary Dreams. Below it, she began listing programs, after-school reading clubs, writing workshops, storytelling sessions. "There's something else," Victoria said, pulling out the old journal she and Emma had recovered from the secret room. "I think it's time we shared our story." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The journal, the letters we never sent, the whole journey. It's a story about friendship lost and found, about redemption and second chances. Maybe it could help other people understand that it's never too late to make things right." Sophie's eyes lit up. "A book, we could make it the first publication of the new bookshop's publishing program?" Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Every great story needs a heart, and this one has Sophie. She brought all of you back together." Richard stood, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where Sophie had started planting. New shoots were already breaking through the soil, reaching for the sun. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "it takes a child to remind us of who we once were and who we could still become." The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating Sophie's whiteboard with its dreams and plans. The girl stood before it, marker in hand, adding one final note at the bottom: "Grand opening. A new chapter begins." Emma watched her daughter with pride, remembering the tiny baby she'd once cradled in the original bookshop. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked the room at large. "We're not just restoring a building or a business. We're rebuilding a family." Victoria squeezed her friend's hand tighter. "We're writing our own happy ending." "No," Sophie corrected, turning from her whiteboard with a smile. "We're writing a new beginning." The transformation of Emma's bookshop began on a warm Monday morning, exactly 1 month after the emotional reunion. The construction crew arrived to find an unusual sight: a 7-year-old girl in a hard hat, clutching detailed blueprints and speaking authoritatively about load-bearing walls. "The original architectural features need to be preserved," Sophie instructed, pointing to the ornate moldings. "They're part of the historical registration requirements." The construction foreman looked to Richard for confirmation, clearly amused by the young project manager. Richard simply nodded, having learned to trust Sophie's meticulous research and planning. Inside, Victoria and Emma worked together to catalogue the remaining books and fixtures. Each item they touched sparked a memory: the reading nook where they'd spent countless afternoons, the counter where they'd served hot chocolate during winter story times, the creaky third step that had always announced late-night visitors to their secret room. "Remember when we tried to start a midnight book club?" Victoria asked, carefully wrapping an antique reading lamp. Emma laughed, the sound echoing in the empty space. "And Mrs. Peterson from next door thought we were running a secret society." "Technically we were," Victoria replied, gesturing to their old club manifestos still tacked to the bulletin board: the Literary Liberation League Reading Revolution headquarters. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with lunch for everyone, setting up an impromptu picnic among the renovation supplies. She'd prepared all their old favorites, the same sandwiches and cookies she'd made for Emma and Victoria during their study sessions years ago. "Some recipes," she said with a knowing smile, "are worth preserving." As they ate, Richard reviewed the construction timeline with Mr. Chen, who had taken a personal interest in the project. "The historical status reinstatement should be finalized by next week," the lawyer reported, "and I've drawn up the partnership agreements as requested." The papers lay on a makeshift table, simple, straightforward documents that transformed the property into a true collaboration between the Sterlings and the Richardsons. No corporate jargon, no hidden clauses, just honest words binding old friends in a new venture. Sophie, who had been examining the building's foundation with the structural engineer, rushed in with excitement. "Mom, Victoria, they found something behind the old shelves." Everyone followed her to a previously hidden alcove where workers had discovered a time capsule, a small metal box Emma and Victoria had sealed away during their senior year of high school. Inside were their college acceptance letters, friendship bracelets, and a handwritten mission statement for the bookshop's future. Victoria read it aloud, her voice thick with emotion. We pledge to create a space where stories live and dreams grow, where everyone who enters feels the magic of possibility. You know, Emma interrupted softly, that's still a pretty good mission statement. Richard, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. It's perfect, actually. Simple, sincere, focused on community. Everything a modern business should be. Sophie was already adding it to her ever-growing project notebook. We could engrave it above the new entrance, she suggested, and maybe add something about new stories being written every day. As the afternoon progressed, more people from the neighborhood began stopping by, drawn by the activity at the long-abandoned building. Old customers shared memories, local kids pressed their faces against the windows, and current business owners offered their support. This place was the heart of the community, an elderly gentleman told Richard. When it closed, we lost more than just a bookshop. Victoria overheard the comment and joined them. Then it's a good thing we're not just reopening a bookshop, she said. We're reviving a community center, a meeting place, a sanctuary for storytellers and dreamers. Emma watched her daughter directing contractors and charming neighbors, marveling at how Sophie had orchestrated not just a reunion, but a renaissance. The basement that had once been her hiding place would soon welcome children who needed a safe space to learn and grow. The secret room that had sheltered two best friends would become a haven for future generations of writers and readers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, Sophie gathered everyone in the main room. I think, she announced with all the gravity a 7-year-old could muster, it's time to write the first page of our new story. She pulled out a fresh journal, a gift from Mrs. Rodriguez, and opened it to the first page. One by one, each person present wrote a line, beginning with Emma and Victoria's original mission statement and ending with Sophie's simple declaration, "Some stories take 15 years to tell, but the best ones are worth waiting for." As renovation work progressed on Emma's bookshop, each day brought new discoveries and challenges. The construction crew had uncovered a series of old letters tucked into the walls during the initial phase of restoration, correspondence between Emma's grandmother, the original owner, and various authors who had visited the shop over the decades. "Look at this one," Emma exclaimed, carefully unfolding a yellowed envelope. "It's from that mystery writer who used to hold midnight reading sessions here, remember, Victoria? We'd sneak down to listen from behind the shelves." Victoria leaned over her shoulder, their heads close together like schoolgirls sharing secrets again. "Margaret Sullivan. I can't believe she actually wrote these letters by hand. She was already famous by then." Sophie, who had appointed herself the official archivist of all discoveries, carefully catalogued each letter in a leather-bound album. "These could be part of our opening exhibition," she suggested, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We could create a timeline of the shop's literary history." Richard, who had been overseeing the structural reinforcement of the building, called everyone to the second floor. The workers had discovered something unusual behind a false wall, a complete collection of first editions, carefully preserved in a hidden cabinet. "My grandmother's private collection," Emma whispered, running her fingers along the spines. "She always said she was saving these for something special, but she never told me what." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had arrived with her usual impeccable timing and a basket of sandwiches, studied the books with knowing eyes. Perhaps she was saving them for this very moment, when the bookshop would be reborn. The discovery sparked an idea in Victoria's mind. What if we created a rare books room, not just for display, but as a research space for scholars and writers? We could partner with the university. Sophie was already adding this to her ever-expanding plans, but something else had caught her attention, a small diary wedged behind the first editions. As she opened it, a pressed flower fell from between its pages. "Mom," she called out, her voice filled with curiosity. "I think this was your grandmother's journal." Emma took the diary with trembling hands, and as she began to read, her eyes widened. "She knew," she said softly. "She knew this would happen someday." The last entry, dated just weeks before the original sale, read, "My darling Emma, if you're reading this, it means the bookshop has found its way back to you. I've watched you and Victoria grow up between these shelves, and I know that someday when the time is right, you'll understand that some friendships are strong enough to survive any storm. The first editions are your inheritance, not to keep, but to share. Use them to rebuild not just the shop, but the dreams it once held. Victoria wiped tears from her eyes as Emma read the words aloud. Richard, who had been maintaining his businesslike demeanor throughout the renovation, found himself deeply moved by the grandmother's foresight. She believed in second chances, Sophie observed, wise beyond her years. Just like you did when you found me, Richard. The construction foreman interrupted their moment of reflection with news that the original skylight had been uncovered above what would become the writer's sanctuary. As sunlight streamed through the newly exposed glass, illuminating the dust. Motes dancing in the air, everyone fell silent, aware they were witnessing something magical. Mrs. Rodriguez broke the spell by beginning to unpack her basket. Even magical moments need fuel, she declared, setting out her famous empanadas, and I believe this calls for a proper celebration. As they gathered around the makeshift picnic, Emma opened her mother's journal to read more, but something else fell from its pages, a blueprint yellowed with age but still clearly legible. It showed plans for an addition to the bookshop that had never been built, an expansion that almost perfectly matched Sophie's design for the Literary Arts Center. Great minds think alike, Victoria smiled, comparing the old blueprint to Sophie's drawings. Or perhaps, Emma suggested, watching her daughter excitedly explain her plans to the construction foreman, some dreams are simply meant to be, waiting for the right moment and the right people to make them real. The day's discoveries had energized everyone, adding new layers of meaning to their project. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the partially renovated space, Sophie gathered everyone in what would become the main reading room. "I think," she announced, pulling out her project notebook, "it's time to add another chapter to our story, one about hidden treasures and family legacies, about dreams that skip generations until they find the right moment to bloom." The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to the bookshop as the renovation entered its final phases. Victoria had taken charge of the interior design, working closely with Emma to blend modern comfort with the building's historical charm. The old reading nooks were being restored, each one themed after a different literary genre, while new technology was seamlessly integrated into the classical architecture. Sophie's Literary Arts Center was taking shape on the second floor, with spaces designed specifically for writing workshops, book clubs, and community events. The young girl had insisted on a special corner dedicated to aspiring young authors, complete with child-sized desks and a mini library of writing guides. "Every writer needs their own space," she explained to Richard, who had found himself increasingly involved in the details of the project, even the little ones. Richard, who had once viewed the bookshop merely as a business acquisition, now spent his lunch break sitting on the newly installed window seat, watching the transformation with growing pride. Today he was reviewing the applications for the Literacy Center's first scholarship program. "I never understood before," he admitted to Emma as she joined him, "how a place could be more than just a business, how it could be a part of people's stories." Emma smiled, remembering countless afternoons spent in this very spot. "That's what my grandmother always said. Books are just the beginning. It's the connections they create that matter." Victoria burst in, excitement radiating from her usually composed features. "The Historical Society just called. They're not just approving our restoration, they're giving us an award for cultural preservation." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been organizing the new cafe space, emerged with a tray of celebratory hot chocolate, her special recipe that had sustained Emma and Victoria through countless study sessions years ago. "Some traditions," she said, with a knowing smile, "deserve to be preserved." As they sipped their chocolate, Sophie called everyone to the writer's sanctuary. The space had been completed first at her insistence, and she had something special to show them. The room, with its restored skylight and comfortable writing nooks, held a surprise, a wall of photographs documenting the bookshop's history. "I found these in Grandma's journal," Sophie explained, pointing to the carefully arranged images. "And these are from Victoria's old albums, and these," she gestured to a blank space, These are for the new memories we'll make. The photographs told a story. Emma's grandmother on opening day, young Emma and Victoria doing homework among the shelves, community events and author visits, and finally, recent pictures of the renovation process. It was a visual timeline of dreams, setbacks, and renewal. Mr. Chen arrived with the final paperwork for the historical designation, but his attention was immediately drawn to the photo wall. "I know," he said thoughtfully. "In all my years of handling property transactions, I've never seen a place come full circle quite like this." Victoria wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, just like she used to do when they were teenagers sharing secrets. "Maybe because it's not just about the building, it's about the people, the stories, the second chances. And the third chances," Sophie added wisely, "and however many chances it takes to get things right." As afternoon sun streamed through, the skylight, casting a golden glow over the gathered family, for that's what they had become, Richard cleared his throat. "I have an announcement," he said, uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been thinking about the future, about legacy." Everyone turned to look at him, curious about his unusual demeanor. "I'm stepping down as CEO of Sterling Corporation," he continued. "I'm establishing a new foundation instead, the Richardson Sterling Literary Trust. Its mission will be to support independent bookstores and literacy programs across the country." The room fell silent as the implications of his announcement sank in. This wasn't just about one bookshop anymore. It was about creating ripples of change that would touch countless lives. Emma was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother would have loved this. She always said, books had the power to change the world one story at a time." Sophie, ever practical even in emotional moments, was already adding this new development to her project notebook. "We'll need a bigger whiteboard," she declared, making everyone laugh. As they stood together in the sanctuary, surrounded by the echoes of past stories and the promise of future ones, Victoria raised her hot chocolate mug in a toast. "To Emma's bookshop, where every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. And to the people brave enough to write their own endings," Sophie added, her young voice carrying the wisdom of generations. The evening before the grand reopening of Emma's bookshop buzzed with nervous energy. The renovations were complete, every book perfectly placed on gleaming shelves, every reading nook arranged with careful precision. The newly installed copper bell above the door caught the last rays of sunset, casting warm reflections across the polished hardwood floors. Victoria stood in the center of the main room, clipboard in hand, running through final checks. "The local newspaper will be here at 9 sharp, she announced, to no one in particular. The mayor confirmed her attendance, and the university's literature department is sending a delegation." "Always the perfectionist," Emma teased, adjusting a display of leather-bound classics. "Some things never change." "Some things do," Victoria replied softly, setting down her clipboard. 15 years ago, I cared more about social standing, cared friendship. Now look at us." Sophie, who had been arranging her special Young Authors Corner, looked up from her work. "Sometimes people just need a reminder of who they really are," she said, her words carrying that uncanny wisdom that still surprised the adults. Richard emerged from the new rare books room where he'd been securing the first editions in their custom-built cases. The room had become his pet project, a space where history and literature intersected. "The university's curator approved our preservation methods," he reported. "She said our climate control system exceeds museum standards." "A far cry from your original plans for this building," Emma observed, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only gentle amusement at how much had changed. Mrs. Rodriguez bustled in from the cafe area, carrying a tray of her signature hot chocolate. "A test run for tomorrow," she explained, but everyone knew it was her way of marking significant moments. The rich aroma filled the space, mingling with the scent of new books and fresh paint. "I found something interesting," Sophie announced, pulling a dusty volume from her messenger bag. It was a ledger from the bookshop's first year of operation, discovered in one of the last boxes they'd unpacked. "Look at this entry from opening day." The group gathered around as Sophie read aloud. "Today we open our doors, not just to sell books, but to nurture dreams. Every story on these shelves is a possibility. Every reader who enters is a friend we haven't met yet. May this place be a sanctuary for all who seek wisdom, comfort, or adventure between pages. My grandmother wrote that, Emma whispered, recognizing the elegant handwriting. And now, 60 years later, we're reopening with the same spirit. Victoria squeezed her friend's hand, but this time we're adding our own chapter to the story. Richard, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. I've been thinking about legacy lately, not the kind measured in profit margins or property values, but in lives touched, in stories shared. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Tomorrow, when we reopen these doors, we're not just launching a business. We're continuing a tradition of community and connection. Sophie had moved to the writer's sanctuary, her favorite spot in the renovated building. The others followed, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold visible through the skylight. I wrote something, Sophie announced, pulling out her ever-present notebook. For tomorrow's ceremony. The adults settled into the comfortable chairs, arranged in a circle just as Emma and Victoria had once arranged beanbags in their secret room years ago. Mrs. Rodriguez distributed the hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows to Sophie's cup. Every story has a beginning, Sophie read, her young voice clear and confident, but the best ones don't really end. They just keep growing, like trees with deep roots and branches reaching for the sky. This bookshop is like that, a story that started before I was born, that grew through happy times and sad ones, that seemed to end but was really just waiting for the next chapter. Victoria wiped a tear from her eye, while Emma beamed with maternal pride. Richard, who had once viewed emotion in business as a weakness, found himself deeply moved. Tomorrow, Sophie continued, we're not just opening a bookshop. We're opening our hearts to new possibilities, new friendships, new dreams, and the best part is, everyone who walks through those doors becomes part of the story. As night fell, the group remained in the sanctuary, sharing memories and hopes for the future. The bookshop seemed to hold its breath, ready for its new beginning. Outside, a light rain began to fall, drumming gently on the skylight. The same sound that had accompanied Richard and Sophie's first meeting now transformed from an ending into a beginning. Mrs. Rodriguez gathered the empty cups, humming softly. In my country, she said, we have a saying. Some places have souls built not of bricks and mortar, but of love and memories. This place has always had a soul. Tomorrow it will have a new purpose. The morning of the reopening dawned, clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the bookshop's restored windows in ribbons of gold. Emma arrived first, using her key to enter the quiet space. She stood for a moment in the doorway, remembering all the mornings she'd watched her grandmother do the same, preparing for a new day of possibilities. Victoria arrived minutes later, carrying fresh flowers for the reading nooks. Without a word, she began arranging them exactly as Emma's grandmother had always done. Purple irises for the mystery section, sunny daisies for children's books, elegant roses for classics. You remember, Emma said softly, touching a delicate iris petal. I remember everything, Victoria replied. The flowers, the way your grandmother would greet every customer by name, how she kept special books aside for people she thought needed them. Sophie burst in, practically vibrating with excitement, her arms full of hand-drawn signs for the different sections. She'd insisted on making them herself, claiming that personal touches were more important than professional perfection. The television crew is setting up outside, she reported, and there's already a line forming. Mr. Chen is handing out numbered tickets so everyone can enter in an orderly fashion. Richard arrived next, looking unusually casual in a sweater rather than his usual business suit. He carried a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. I found this in my office safe, he explained, handling it to Emma. I think today is the right time to return it. Emma unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a worn leather-bound book, Pride and Prejudice, her grandmother's personal copy, complete with her marginal notes. It had somehow ended up in the Sterling Corporation's possession during the original acquisition. I didn't know I had it until Sophie's investigation led me to review the old files, Richard admitted. It should have been returned long ago. Before Emma could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with a breakfast cart laden with pastries and coffee. No one should face a big day on an empty stomach, she declared, setting up an impromptu buffet on the new cafe counter. As they shared this quiet breakfast, Sophie pulled out her project notebook one last time. "I've been keeping a list," she announced, "of all the ways this place has changed us." The adults paused, curiosity piqued. "Richard learned that true success isn't measured in dollars," Sophie read. Victoria remembered that friendship matters more than social status. Mom found her way home to her best friend. Mrs. Rodriguez got to share her secret recipes with a bigger family. And me. She paused, looking around at the faces that had become so dear to her. "I learned that sometimes the best stories are the ones we write together." A knock at the door interrupted the moment, Mr. Chen looking apologetic. "The mayor has arrived early," he reported, "and the crowd outside has doubled." Victoria smoothed her dress, professional instincts kicking in, but Emma caught her hand. "Wait," she said. "Before we open those doors, I want to say something." Everyone gathered closer, forming a circle in the heart of the bookshop. "My grandmother used to say that books are like friends. They come into our lives exactly when we need them most," Emma began. "But sometimes it's not just the books. Sometimes it's the places that hold them and the people who share them." She looked at Sophie, then at Richard and Victoria. "This place brought us back together in ways I never thought possible. And now it will do the same for others," Victoria added, squeezing her friend's hand. Richard cleared his throat. "The Sterling Corporation's motto was always building future success, but I think I like Sophie's version better, building future stories." A cheer erupted from outside, the crowd catching sight of movement through the windows. Sophie ran to peek through the curtains. "There must be hundreds of people," she reported excitedly. "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting," Emma smiled. "After all, every one of them has a story waiting to begin." They moved toward the entrance, where the new copper bell waited to ring in this new chapter. Sophie reached for the door handle, then paused, looking back at her extended family with bright eyes. "Ready to start our next chapter?" she asked. The answer came in unison. "Ready?" The copper bell chimed for the first time as Sophie pushed open the doors of Emma's bookshop, its clear tone echoing through the morning air. The waiting crowd erupted in applause, their enthusiasm washing over the family gathered in the doorway. The mayor stepped forward first, offering official congratulations, but her scripted speech faltered as she took in the transformed space. The bookshop literally glowed from within, sunlight dancing across polished wood and gleaming brass fixtures. Each reading nook beckoned with promises of comfort and adventure, while the aroma of fresh coffee and books created an irresistible atmosphere. "This is more than I expected," the mayor admitted, going off script. "This isn't just a business reopening, it's like stepping into a dream." Victoria, ever the professional, began guiding the first groups through the space. But even her polished presentation style softened as she shared stories about the renovation, about the history they'd uncovered, about the future they envisioned. In the children's section, Sophie had set up a special welcome station. "Every new reader gets to choose their first book," she explained to the gathered families, "just like my mom did when she was little and her mom before her." The university delegation found themselves drawn to the rare books room, where Richard proudly showcased the preservation systems and first editions. "These books aren't just for display," he explained. "They're part of our community scholarship program. Students and researchers will have access to these historical treasures." Emma floated through the crowd, greeting old customers who had shopped here during her grandmother's time. Many brought photographs, memories, and even old receipts they'd kept as bookmarks. Each story they shared added another layer to the rich tapestry of the bookshop's history. Mrs. Rodriguez presided over the cafe area, serving her famous hot chocolate and pastries. "Food feeds the body," she told visitors, "but books feed the soul. Here, we nourish both." The writer's sanctuary on the second floor quickly became a focal point of interest. Local authors who had come to cover the event for various publications found themselves lingering, drawn in by the peaceful atmosphere, and inspired by the view through the skylight. "I wrote my first story in the original shop," one elderly gentleman told Sophie. "Your grandmother, your great-grandmother, used to let me sit here for hours working on my novel, I never finished it, but now you can, Sophie finished for him, gesturing to the comfortable writing spaces. That's what this place is for, finishing old stories and starting new ones. The television crews captured it all. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, the first customers making purchases, the community leaders touring the literacy center in the basement. But they also caught the smaller moments. Richard helping a young boy reach a book on a high shelf, Victoria and Emma sharing tearful hugs with old friends, Sophie conducting impromptu storytelling sessions in her special corner. As the morning progressed, Mr. Chen approached Emma with an unexpected gift, a petition signed by local business owners. They want to officially rename this block Bookshop Row, he explained. Your renovation has inspired others. The coffee shop next door is expanding their reading room, and the art gallery across the street wants to collaborate on literary exhibitions. The mayor, who had lingered far longer than her schedule allowed, overheard this exchange. This is exactly what downtown needed, she declared. Not just another business, but a heart, a place where community and culture come together. Victoria found Emma in their old secret room, now transformed into a cozy meeting space, but still bearing traces of their teenage dreams. Remember when we thought we'd open our own shop someday? She asked, settling into one of the window seats. We did, Emma replied, gesturing to the bustling scene below. It just took a little longer than we planned. And a little help, Victoria added, watching Sophie organize a group of children for a reading circle. From an unexpected angel. The sunlight streaming through the skylight caught the copper bell just right, sending shimmers of light dancing across the walls like pages turning in an invisible book. Below, the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the gentle rustle of pages created a symphony of new beginnings. By early afternoon, the initial rush had settled into a steady stream of visitors, each finding their own special corner of the bookshop to explore. The television crews had packed up their equipment, but the magic they'd captured continued to unfold in quieter, more personal ways. In the rare books room, Richard was surprised to find himself engaged in an animated discussion with a group of young entrepreneurs. Instead of talking about profit margins and market shares, he found himself sharing lessons about community value and the true meaning of success. You see that little girl there? He said, pointing to Sophie, who was conducting a tour for other children. She taught me that the best investments aren't always the ones you can measure in dollars. Sometimes they're measured in smiles, in moments, in lives touched. Victoria, meanwhile, had abandoned her carefully planned schedule to sit in one of the reading nooks with old friends from high school. They laughed over yearbook photos someone had brought, remembering countless afternoons spent in these very spots. You've brought back more than just a bookshop, one friend told her. You've brought back our childhood dreams. Emma found herself drawn to the newly installed community board, already filling with notices, reading groups seeking members, aspiring writers looking for critique partners, teachers planning field trips. Each note represented a thread in the new tapestry they were weaving. Mrs. Rodriguez had transformed the cafe into an impromptu storytelling space, serving her special hot chocolate while parents and children shared favorite books. Her recipes, once secret family treasures, were now printed on beautiful cards for customers to take home. Books feed the mind, she told a young mother, but memories feed the heart. Here we create both. Sophie's Young Author's Corner had become an unexpected hit. Children sprawled on cushions, writing their own stories inspired by the day's events. Their parents watched in amazement as their usually technology-obsessed offspring discovered the joy of putting pen to paper. "Mom," Sophie called out, waving Emma over. "Listen to what Sarah wrote." A shy girl with glasses read from her notebook. Once there was a magical bookshop where dreams came true, not because of spells or wands, but because people believed in each other. The university's literature department chair, who had planned a brief appearance, found herself staying through the afternoon. "This is what we've been missing in our teaching," she told Emma. "The connection between literature and life, between stories and community." As the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows through the windows, Mr. Chen gathered everyone for a surprise announcement. The Historical Society had fast-tracked their application for landmark status, adding a special designation, Living Literary Heritage Site. This means, he explained, beaming with pride, that Emma's bookshop is now officially recognized not just as a historical building, but as an active part of our cultural heritage. Richard stepped forward, adding his own announcement. The Richardson Sterling Literary Trust's first act will be establishing a fellowship program. Every year we'll select a young writer to spend 12 months here, working on their first book. The news was met with enthusiastic applause, but Sophie wasn't finished with surprises. She unveiled a new addition to the photo wall, a massive collage of pictures taken throughout the renovation, culminating in images from today's grand reopening. "See," she said, pointing to various photographs, "every ending can be a new beginning if you look at it the right way." Victoria wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, just like when they were teenagers. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she whispered, "not just of the bookshop, but of all of us." Emma watched as Richard helped a young boy select his first chapter book, as Mrs. Rodriguez shared her secret hot chocolate recipe with a group of admirers, as Sophie gathered more children for another storytelling session. The bookshop hummed with life, with possibility, with the kind of magic that comes from dreams shared and realized. "She knew," Emma replied softly. "Somehow, she knew this would happen. That's why she left those clues, those books, those messages for us to find." The copper bell chimed again as new visitors entered, its sound now familiar and welcoming. Through the skylight, the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold, as if blessing this new chapter in their ongoing story. As evening approached on the grand reopening day, the bookshop took on a different kind of magic. The overhead lights dimmed automatically, activating the soft reading lamps in each nook. The cafe area transformed for a special evening event, the first of many planned literary gatherings. Victoria stood at the podium, her usual corporate polish softened by genuine emotion. "When we began this journey," she addressed the gathered crowd, "we thought we were just renovating a building. Instead, we found ourselves renovating our lives." The evening's event was titled Community Stories, and residents had been invited to share their memories of the original bookshop. The TTE insights revealed surprised everyone, especially Richard, who sat in the back row taking careful notes. An elderly teacher spoke about how Emma's grandmother had helped her build her classroom library on a modest salary, extending credit and finding affordable editions. A successful author revealed that his first story had been written in the secret room upstairs, encouraged by the quiet acceptance he found there when the rest of the world seemed unwelcoming. "This place was never just about selling books," the author explained, gesturing to the lovingly restored spaces around them. "It was about selling possibilities." Sophie, who had insisted on staying up late for the event, sat between Emma and Mrs. Rodriguez, recording everything in her ever-present notebook. Her project had evolved from renovation plans to capturing the soul of the bookshop through people's stories. "Every person who comes here adds something to the story," she whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez, "like ingredients in your special recipes." The housekeeper smiled knowingly. "Yes, mi pequeña, and like my recipes, the secret is in how everything comes together." Richard surprised everyone by stepping up to share his own story. Gone was the calculating businessman who had once seen the property as merely another acquisition. In his place stood a man humbled by the realization of what he had almost destroyed and what he had helped rebuild. 15 years ago, I made a decision based purely on numbers, he admitted. I saw an old building in a prime location, not the heart of a community. But life has a way of teaching us its most important lessons through unexpected teachers. He smiled at Sophie. Sometimes those teachers come in very small packages. The event continued with more stories, each one adding layers to the rich tapestry of the bookshop's history and its meaning to the community. A young woman spoke about finding courage through books during difficult times. A retired librarian recalled partnership programs with the original shop that had brought authors to local schools. Emma watched it all from her favorite reading nook, the same spot where she had spent countless hours as a child. Victoria joined her, carrying 2 cups of Mrs. Rodriguez's hot chocolate. Remember when we thought we knew everything? Victoria asked, settling into the comfortable space. Back when we were teenagers planning our futures, we knew nothing, Emma laughed softly. And everything, in a way. We knew this place was special. We just didn't understand how special. Sophie appeared with her notebook, squeezing between them just as she had squeezed into their hearts. I added something new to our mission statement, she announced. Want to hear it? The women nodded, and Sophie read from her careful handwriting. A book can change a life, but a bookshop can change a community. We are not just keepers of stories, we are gardeners of dreams, helping them grow from seedling ideas into full-bloom realities. Victoria blinked back tears. When did you get so wise? I had good teachers, Sophie replied, looking meaningfully at both women. And a great story to learn from. As the evening progressed, Mr. Chen circulated with news about other businesses in the area, taking inspiration from the bookshop's transformation. The art gallery across the street was planning literary-themed exhibitions. The cafe next door would host poetry readings. Even the old theater down the block was considering a series of book-to-film screenings. It's like dropping a stone in a pond, Richard observed, joining their group. The ripples keep spreading. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a fresh batch of pastries, announcing that she had finally decided to write down her recipe book. For the cafe, she explained, and for the next generation of dream makers. Through the skylight, stars began to appear, twinkling down on the gathered community. The bookshop seemed to glow from within, not just from the carefully placed lighting, but from the warmth of shared stories and renewed connections. The first week after the grand reopening passed in a blur of activity. Each day brought new visitors, new stories, and new possibilities. The Writer's Sanctuary hosted its first workshop, led by the author who had shared his story at the opening night event. The Literacy Center in the basement began its first reading program, with a waiting list that surprised even the most optimistic. Organizers. On a quiet Sunday morning before the shop opened to the public, the core group gathered for what had become their daily ritual. Mrs. Rodriguez served breakfast in the cafe, her famous pastries now accompanied by selections from her newly documented recipe collection. The food critic from the local paper is coming next week, she announced, trying to sound casual but unable to hide her excitement. He wants to do a feature on literature's kitchen. That's what they're calling our cafe. Sophie, who had taken to arriving early to update her project notebook, looked up with interest. We should create special menu items named after books, she suggested, like the Secret Garden herb tea or Little Women's lavender scones. Victoria, who had finally learned to relax her rigid scheduling, smiled at the girls' endless creativity. Speaking of names, she said, the university called. They want to name their new creative writing scholarship after Emma's grandmother. Emma touched the locket she wore, another treasure discovered during the renovation, containing a tiny photograph of her grandmother on the shop's original. Opening day. She would have loved that, she said softly, but I think she would have loved this even more, seeing how the shop has brought people together again. Richard entered from the rare books room, carrying a leather-bound volume. Look what just arrived, he announced, placing it carefully on the table. It was a specially commissioned guest book, its pages already filling with messages from visitors. I thought we could keep it as a record of new memories to go along with all the history we've preserved. Sophie immediately opened it, reading aloud from random entries. Found the courage to start writing again. Felt like coming home. My children love stories as much as I did at their age. The copper bell chimed as Mr. Chen arrived earlier than usual. I have news, he announced, unable to contain his excitement. The City Council approved our proposal. The entire block will be designated as a cultural heritage district, with Emma's bookshop as its anchor. The implications of this announcement took a moment to sink in. It meant protection for the area's historic character, support for arts and culture initiatives, and a commitment to maintaining the community-focused atmosphere they had worked so hard to create. There's more, Mr. Chen continued. Other neighborhoods are interested in the model we've created here. They want to know how to build their own literary communities. Richard set down his coffee cup thoughtfully. The Richardson Sterling Literary Trust could help with that. Create a blueprint for other communities to follow. Victoria pulled out her tablet, but instead of her usual business applications, she opened a document titled Community Building Through Stories, a Guide. Already working on it, she said with a smile. Some habits die hard. Emma watched her best friend with affection, remembering the corporate warrior she had been just months ago. You've changed, she observed. We all have, Victoria replied, gesturing around the table. Richard's learning to measure success in smiles instead of dollars. I'm learning that influence can be gentle instead of forceful. You're learning to trust again. And I'm learning that sometimes the best stories are the ones we live, Sophie added, wise beyond her years as always. Mrs. Rodriguez began clearing the breakfast dishes, but paused to add her own observation. In my country, we say that a house becomes a home when it holds enough love. This place has always been more than a shop, it's a home for dreams. Through the windows, they could see the first customers of the day gathering. Sunday had become Family Reading Day, with special programs and activities designed to bring generations together through stories. Emma stood to unlock the doors, but Sophie stopped her. Wait, she said, pulling out her notebook one last time. I want to read you something first. Everyone settled back into their seats as Sophie turned to a fresh page. A week ago, we opened these doors and invited the world into our dream. But the truth is, the dream was here all along, waiting in dusty corners and hidden rooms, in old letters and forgotten photographs, in memories of friendship and promises of tomorrow. We didn't just restore a bookshop, we restored faith in the power of stories to bring people together, to heal old wounds, to build new bridges. The adults exchanged emotional glances as Sophie continued. Every book on these shelves is a door waiting to be opened. Every person who walks through our door becomes part of our story. And our story, like all the best ones, has no real ending, just new chapters waiting to be written. 1 month after the reopening, Emma's bookshop had settled into a rhythm that somehow felt both new and familiar. The morning sun streamed through the restored windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like literary fairy dust. Victoria arrived early, as she did every day now, not from a sense of obligation, but from genuine eagerness to start each new day in this magical space. She found Sophie already there, curled up in her favorite reading nook, surrounded by papers. The girl had taken her role as the bookshop's unofficial historian seriously, documenting each day's events with the dedication of a seasoned chronicler. What are you working on? Victoria asked, setting down her bag. Sophie looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. Remember how we found all those old letters in the walls during renovation? I'm creating something similar for future generations to find, a time capsule of sorts. The project had grown beyond simple documentation. Sophie had collected photographs, written accounts, and even small artifacts from the renovation and reopening, but more importantly, she had gathered stories from visitors. Their memories of the old shop, their hopes for the new one, their dreams for the future. Richard arrived next, carrying a stack of applications. The Richardson Sterling Literary Trust had received overwhelming interest from communities across the country, all hoping to replicate their success. But instead of seeing it as a business opportunity, Richard had approached it with the same care and attention he now gave to selecting books for the shop's collection. Each community needs its own unique approach, he explained, spreading the papers on a table. We're not creating franchises, we're nurturing individual dreams. Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from her kitchen, the aroma of fresh pastries and coffee following her. She'd begun teaching weekly cooking classes in the cafe, combining her culinary skills with storytelling. Food and stories, she often said, both need the right ingredients and plenty of love. The morning's first event was about to begin, a special gathering of the newly formed Legacy Readers Group. These were people who had frequented the original bookshop, now bringing their grandchildren to create new memories. Emma watched them arrive, each carrying a beloved book to share. Your grandmother would have loved this, Victoria said softly, joining Emma at the window. She did more than love it. She planned for it, Emma replied, touching the locket she always wore now. All those clues she left, all those hidden treasures. She knew someday we'd need them to find our way back here. In the rare books room, a university professor was conducting research for a paper on the impact of independent bookshops on community development. She'd chosen Emma's bookshop as her primary case study, fascinated by how the renovation had sparked a renaissance in the entire neighborhood. Mr. Chen arrived with more good news. The city had approved their proposal for a literary festival to be held in the fall. The entire block would be transformed into a celebration of books, stories, and community. Already, authors and publishers were calling to participate. "It's becoming exactly what we dreamed it would be," Emma mused, watching Sophie lead a group of young writers in their weekly workshop. But somehow also something more. The something more was evident in every corner of the shop. It showed in the way Richard now spent hours helping customers find exactly the right book, forgetting completely about his former corporate life. It showed in Victoria's relaxed smile as she chatted with old friends and new visitors alike. Her designer suits replaced by comfortable clothes, more suited to a bookseller. It showed in the way Mrs. Rodriguez's cafe had become a gathering place for storytellers of all ages, where food and tales were shared with equal enthusiasm. It showed in Mr. Chen's proud tours of the building's historical features, each preservation detail a testament to the power of protecting what matters. But perhaps it showed most clearly in Sophie, who had transformed from a mysterious child seeking answers into the heart and soul of the bookshop's renaissance. Her young authors program had already produced a collection of stories that would be published in the fall, the first book to bear the newly established Emma's Bookshop publishing imprint. As the day progressed, Emma found herself drawn to the writer's sanctuary. The room had taken on a life of its own, filled with the gentle tap of laptop keys and the scratch of pens on paper. Dreams were being born here, stories taking shape, lives being transformed one word at a time. A small girl, probably no older than Sophie, approached Emma with a notebook clutched to her chest. "Is it true," she asked, "that this place is magical?" Emma smiled, remembering all the times she'd felt that same magic as a child. "The real magic," she replied, "isn't in the place itself. It's in what happens when people come together to share their stories." The autumn colors had begun to paint the trees outside Emma's bookshop when Sophie made an unexpected discovery. While organizing the last of the renovation documentation, she found a sealed envelope tucked inside her great-grandmother's old journal. The handwriting on the front simply read, "For the moment when the story comes full circle." She gathered everyone in the writer's sanctuary, Emma, Victoria, Richard, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Mr. Chen. The evening sun streamed through the skylight, bathing them all in warm golden light, as Sophie carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in the same elegant hand that had penned the journal entries they'd discovered during the renovation. "To those who have found their way, back to these pages, if you're reading this, then the bookshop has awakened once again. I always knew it would. Places like this don't really sleep, they wait. They wait for the right people to remember their magic, for the right moments to reveal their secrets, for the right hearts to bring them back to life. To my dear Emma, your mother used to sit where you probably sit now, dreaming of stories yet to be told. And her mother, my daughter, did the same. Stories run in our blood, as does the ability to see the magic in ordinary moments. To Victoria, your friendship with Emma was never just about two girls sharing books. It was about two souls recognizing each other's light. Keep shining together. To whoever helped bring this place back to life. Thank you for seeing beyond ledgers and property values. Thank you for understanding that some investments can't be measured in dollars and cents. And to the child who I suspect helped make this all possible. Never lose your belief in the power of stories to change lives. That belief is the truest magic of all. This shop was never meant to be just a business. It was meant to be a lighthouse for dreamers, a harbor for seekers, a home for stories both written and lived. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. With eternal hope, Margaret Richardson, a keeper of stories. As Sophie finished reading, a hushed silence fell over the room. Emma wiped tears from her eyes while Victoria squeezed her hand tight. Richard stood by the window, looking out at the street where Sophie had once huddled in the rain, marveling at how one small moment could change so many lives. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to speak. "She knew," she said softly. "Somehow she knew you would all find your way here." "Not just find our way here," Sophie corrected, wise as ever. "Find our way back to ourselves." The letter had come at a perfect moment. The next day would mark the start of their first literary festival, transforming the entire block into a celebration of stories and community. Authors would give readings in the Writers' Sanctuary, children would create their own books in Sophie's corner, and Mrs. Rodriguez's cafe would serve literary-themed treats. But more than that, the festival would celebrate the transformations that had taken place over the past months. Richard would announce the first recipients of the Richardson Sterling Literary Trust grants, supporting other communities in creating their own centers of literary life. Victoria would unveil plans for a series of writing workshops for underprivileged youth, turning her business acumen toward nurturing new voices. Emma looked around at her assembled family, not just those related by blood, but those bound together by something just as strong, a shared story. "My grandmother wrote that this place was meant to be a lighthouse," she said, "but it's become so much more than that. It's become a beacon of second chances." Sophie added another page to her ever-growing project notebook. On it, she wrote, "Some stories end where they began, but that doesn't mean nothing has changed. Sometimes returning to the beginning with new eyes is the greatest adventure of all." Through the skylight, the first stars of evening began to appear. The copper bell chimed softly in the breeze, its tone carrying promises of stories yet to be told, dreams yet to be dreamed, and chapters yet to be written. Victoria stood, pulling Emma up with her. "Come on," she said, "we have a festival to prepare for." "And more stories to write," Sophie added, closing her notebook with a satisfied smile. As they moved through the shop, turning on the evening lights that made each reading nook glow like a separate universe, Richard paused by the wall of photographs. "You know what?" he said thoughtfully. "I finally understand what true success looks like." Mrs. Rodriguez patted his arm knowingly. "It looks like this," she said, gesturing to the warm, book-filled space around them. "It looks like home." The morning of the literary festival dawned with perfect autumn clarity. Streets that had once been silent were now lined with colorful booths, each dedicated to different aspects of storytelling. The entire block had been transformed into a celebration of literature, with Emma's bookshop standing at its heart, like a proud matriarch watching over her growing family. Sophie stood at the shop's entrance, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with the confidence of a seasoned event planner. She'd insisted on wearing a special outfit for the occasion, a blue dress that matched the one in the old photograph of her great-grandmother on the shop's original opening day. "The children's writing workshop starts in the basement at 10, she informed a group of parents. "And yes, every child will leave with their own handmade book." Inside, Victoria was putting final touches on the Writers' Sanctuary, where established authors would spend the day mentoring aspiring writers. The room had been arranged with intimate conversation areas, each named after a different literary classic. Pride and Prejudice Corner featured delicate teacups and Regency-inspired decor, while Wonderland Nook offered whimsical seating and creative writing prompts. "Remember when this was our secret hideaway?" Emma asked, joining her friend. "Now it's everyone's sanctuary." Richard had transformed the rare books room into a living museum of literary history. First editions were displayed alongside interactive exhibits about the evolution of storytelling, from ancient oral traditions to modern digital platforms. But the centerpiece was a special display dedicated to Margaret Richardson's original vision for the bookshop. "Your grandmother didn't just build a store," he told Emma, adjusting the lighting on a collection of her old letters and journals. "She built a legacy." Mrs. Rodriguez's cafe had become Storyteller's Kitchen, offering dishes inspired by famous literary feasts. The menu included everything from Proust's Madeleines to Pippi Longstocking's pancakes. Each dish came with a small card sharing the story behind its creation. "Food and stories," she reminded everyone who complimented her creations, "both need love to be truly satisfying." Outside, the festival was coming to life. Local artists had painted literary murals on previously blank walls. Street performers acted out scenes from classic novels. A group of children gathered around a storyteller, dressed as a wizard, their eyes wide with wonder as he brought tales to life. Mr. Chen, who had coordinated with city officials, proudly showed off the new street signs designating the area as Bookshop Row. Other businesses had embraced the theme. The cafe next door had become the Inkwell, while the art gallery across the street showcased book-inspired installations. As the morning progressed, the crowds grew. Authors who had once dreamed in the original shop's quiet corners returned to share their success stories. Readers who had discovered their love of books under Margaret Richardson's guidance brought their grandchildren to start new traditions. In Sophie's special corner, young writers worked diligently on their stories, each contributing to a community novel that would be published as part of the shop's new imprint. Their tales wove together themes of friendship, courage, and the power of second chances, echoing the very story that had brought them all together. Victoria found herself drawn to a quiet moment with Emma in their old reading nook. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, watching the festival unfold through the window, "that we'd come full circle like this?" Emma touched her grandmother's locket, which now contained 2 photos, one of the original opening day and one from their recent reopening. "I think part of me always knew we'd find our way back here. Some stories are just meant to be." Sophie appeared with her project notebook, its pages now filled with months of observations and dreams. "I added something new," she announced, settling between them. "Want to hear it?" The women nodded and Sophie read, "Sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we read in books, but the ones we live while we're busy reading them. Sometimes the greatest adventures happen not in far-off lands, but right here, in the spaces between hello and goodbye, between lost and found, between ending and beginning." Through the windows, they could see Richard guiding a group of aspiring entrepreneurs through the shop, sharing lessons about measuring success in smiles rather than dollars. Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching a young girl her secret hot chocolate recipe, passing on not just ingredients but wisdom. Mr. Chen was showing a reporter the historical documents that told the story of the shop's renaissance. "You know what the best part is?" Sophie asked, looking around at the bustling scene. "This is just the beginning of our story." The copper bell chimed as more visitors entered, its clear tone mixing with laughter, conversation, and the rustle of pages being turned. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the breeze like pages from a magical story, while inside, countless new chapters were waiting to be written. As the festival drew to a close, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, casting a magical glow over Bookshop Row. The day had been more successful than anyone could have imagined, with thousands of visitors discovering not just books, but the power of community and shared stories. In the writer's sanctuary, now quiet after a day of workshops and mentoring sessions, Emma found Sophie sitting at the window seat, writing in her project notebook. The girl who had once sought shelter in a basement had blossomed into something extraordinary, a keeper of stories, a weaver of dreams, a bridge between past and present. "What are you writing?" Emma asked, settling beside her daughter. Sophie looked up, her eyes bright with purpose. "I'm writing about today, but also about everything that led to it, about how one rainy night changed everything, about how sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back home." Victoria joined them, followed by Richard and Mrs. Rodriguez. Mr. Chen arrived last, carrying a special edition of the evening newspaper. The front page featured a photograph of all of them standing in front of the shop, with the headline, "More Than Books, How One Shop Rewrote Its Own Story." "Read what they wrote," Mr. Chen urged, handing the paper to Sophie. She cleared her throat and began. In an age of digital entertainment and online shopping, Emma's bookshop proves that some experiences can't be replicated on a screen. This isn't just a store that sells books. It's a place where community comes alive, where stories bridge generations, and where dreams find their wings. Richard, who had spent the day sharing his transformed vision of success with other business leaders, spoke softly. "You know what the reporter asked me? She wanted to know if I regretted giving up my corporate empire for this. I told her that for the first time in my life, I'm building something truly meaningful. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out one last batch of her special hot chocolate, now famous throughout the city. In my country, she said, passing out steaming cups, we have a saying, the sweetest stories are the ones we share. Victoria pulled out an envelope she'd been saving for this moment. Speaking of sharing, she said, the Richardson Sterling Literary Trust received some news today. 10 more communities have been approved for grants to create their own literary centers. Emma's bookshop isn't just one story anymore. It's becoming a movement. Sophie added this to her notebook, then looked up with that wise beyond her years expression. But it all started here, didn't it? With a little girl looking for answers, a man seeking redemption, 2 friends finding their way back to each other, and a dream that refused to be forgotten. Emma touched her grandmother's locket, feeling the weight of generations of storytellers within it. My grandmother used to say that books are like stars. They guide us home when we're lost. But what she didn't say was that sometimes home isn't a place at all. Sometimes it's the people we share our stories with. As night fell, they gathered in the main room of the shop, surrounded by thousands of books and countless possibilities. The copper bell chimed softly in the evening breeze, its tone carrying memories of the past and promises of the future. Sophie stood and walked to the center of the room, her notebook clutched to her chest. I want to read you the last entry, she said, the one that explains what I've learned from all of this. Everyone settled into their favorite spots as Sophie began to read. Some people think endings are the most important part of a story, but I've learned that there's no such thing as a true ending. Every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. Every closed book is an invitation to open another. Every goodbye holds the promise of another hello. The real magic isn't in the words on the page, it's in the way those words bring people together, heal old wounds, build new bridges, and remind us that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. Emma's bookshop isn't just a place that sells stories. It's a place where stories come alive, where dreams take root, and where hope grows stronger with every page we turn together. And the best part? Our story is still being written, one chapter at a time, by everyone who walks through these doors carrying their own dreams, their own hopes, their own stories waiting to be told. The copper bell chimed one final time as Sophie closed her notebook, its clear tone echoing through the quiet shop like a promise. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, twinkling like pages in an endless story. Inside, surrounded by books and loved ones, they had all found something more precious than success or status. They had found their way home. Winter had settled over Bookshop Row, transforming the literary district into a scene worthy of a holiday card. Emma's bookshop's windows glowed warmly against the early evening darkness, frost patterns on the glass creating natural illustrations for the stories within. Inside, the shop had evolved yet again. The success of the literary festival had sparked a series of new initiatives, each more ambitious than the last. Sophie's Young Authors program had expanded to include online sessions with children from around the world, connecting young storytellers across continents. We had 3 kids from Australia in this morning's workshop, Sophie reported excitedly to Emma as they prepared for the evening's event. They stayed up until midnight. Their time just to participate. The evening's gathering was something special, the launch of the first book published under the Emma's Bookshop publishing imprint. Titled Stories Between the Shelves, it was a collection of tales written by the shop's visitors, each capturing a moment of transformation experienced within these walls. Victoria, who had taken charge of the publishing venture, stood at the podium making final adjustments. Her corporate expertise had found a new purpose in nurturing emerging writers. "Remember when our biggest concern was quarterly profits?" she asked Richard, who was arranging chairs for the audience. "That feels like a different lifetime," he replied, straightening a row of seats. "Though I have to admit, the Trust's impact reports are more satisfying than any profit margin I ever achieved." The Richardson Sterling Literary Trust had already helped establish similar literary centers in 5 different cities, each adapted to its community's unique character. But Emma's bookshop remained the heart of the movement, the place where it all began. Mrs. Rodriguez had transformed her cafe into a winter wonderland, with special themed treats for the book launch. Hot chocolate tastes better with a good Story, she always said, and tonight's signature drink was dubbed Writer's Inspiration, her classic recipe enhanced with hints of vanilla and cinnamon. Mr. Chen arrived early, carrying a stack of legal documents that, for once, brought good news. The cultural heritage designation has been expanded, he announced. The entire neighborhood is now protected as a literary landmark district. As guests began to arrive for the book launch, Sophie retreated to her favorite window seat with her ever-present notebook. The page was titled "The Story Continues," and under it, she had begun listing all the ways the bookshop had grown beyond its walls. The Writers' Sanctuary now hosted monthly residencies for authors from around the country. The Literacy Center, in the basement, had partnered with local schools to ensure every child in the district had access to books and writing programs. Even the rare books room had become a hub for literary researchers and historians. "What are you writing now?" Emma asked, joining her daughter. Sophie smiled, that wise look in her eyes that still amazed everyone. "I'm writing about how stories are like seeds. You plant them in good soil, give them light and care, and they grow into something bigger than you ever imagined." Outside, snow began to fall softly, adding another layer of magic to the evening. The copper bell chimed as more guests arrived, each bringing their own story to add to the growing tapestry of the bookshop's legacy. Victoria called everyone to attention as the launch event was about to begin. But before she could start her prepared speech, Sophie stood up, notebook in hand. "I have something to share first," she announced. "Something about how one story can change everything." The room fell silent, all eyes on the young girl who had become the heart of their literary community. Even those who had witnessed Sophie's wisdom before leaned forward, eager to hear what insights she would share on this special night. Sophie stood before the gathered crowd, her small frame somehow filling the entire space with presence. The snow falling outside created a hushed backdrop as she opened her notebook, its pages now worn with months of observations and dreams. "When I first came to this shop," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner, "I thought I was looking for answers. But what I found was something much more valuable. I found questions that needed asking, stories that needed telling, and people who needed reminding of who they really were." The audience sat transfixed as Sophie shared her perspective on the bookshop's transformation. She spoke about Richard's journey from corporate titan to community builder, about Victoria's rediscovery of her authentic self, about Emma's return to her roots, and about Mrs. Rodriguez's recipes becoming a thread that wove people together. "But the real magic," she continued, "isn't in what changed. It's in what was here all along, waiting to be remembered. Like words hidden in invisible ink, sometimes we need the right light to see what's already written in our hearts." Victoria squeezed Emma's hand, both women moved by the profound truth in Sophie's words. Richard stood at the back of the room, his usual business demeanor softened by evident emotion. "This book we're launching tonight," Sophie gestured to the display of stories between the shelves, "isn't just a collection of tales. It's proof that when we make space for stories to be told, we make space for people to become who they're meant to be." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with her special hot chocolate, quietly distributing cups to the emotional audience. Each cup came with a small card featuring a quote from the new book, handwritten in Sophie's careful script. "My great-grandmother knew something important," Sophie continued, touching the locket Emma had given her, "a matching pair to her mother's. She knew that books aren't just escapes from reality, they're bridges to better versions of ourselves. That's why she built this place, and that's why it needed to come back to life." Mr. Chen, who had been taking notes throughout Sophie's speech, looked up with sudden inspiration. "The other literary centers," he whispered to Richard, "they need to hear this perspective." Sophie was now sharing excerpts from her project notebook, reading observations she'd made during the renovation and revival of the shop. Each entry revealed another layer of understanding about how stories connect people, heal wounds, and build communities. "There's something else," she said, turning to a fresh page, "something I've been working on with some friends." She gestured to a group of young writers from her program who sat together near the front. "We call it the Story Keepers Initiative," she explained. "It's a plan to help other communities not just build literary centers, but to discover their own unique stories, because every neighborhood has its own tale waiting to be told, its own magic waiting to be remembered. Victoria stepped forward, recognition dawning in her eyes. That's what we've been missing in the Trust's expansion plans. We've been focusing on the structural elements, but we need to help them find their stories first, Richard finished, already pulling out his phone to make notes. Emma watched her daughter with pride as Sophie outlined the initiative, a program that would help communities discover and preserve their local literary heritage while building new traditions for the future. Because that's what happened here, Sophie concluded, gesturing around the beloved shop. We didn't just restore a building or restart a business, we remembered a story that needed to be told, and in remembering it, we wrote ourselves into its pages. The snow continued to fall outside, creating a cozy intimacy inside the shop as Sophie's words settled over the audience. The copper bell chimed softly as a late arrival slipped in, its tone seeming to underscore the wisdom of her message. So tonight, Sophie said, as we launch this book of stories, we're really celebrating something bigger. We're celebrating the power of remembering who we are, the courage to become who we're meant to be, and the magic that happens when we share our stories with each other. She closed her notebook, but everyone knew this wasn't an ending. It was just another beginning in their ongoing story. Spring arrived at Emma's bookshop, bringing with it a fresh wave of changes. The success of Stories Between the Shelves had caught the attention of the literary world, and the shop had become a beacon for those seeking to understand the true meaning of community building through literature. One particularly bright morning, Sophie sat in her usual window seat, surrounded by letters from children around the world. Each envelope contained stories, dreams, and hopes inspired by the bookshop's transformation. But one letter in particular had captured her attention. "Mom," she called to Emma, who was arranging a new display of local authors' works. "Listen to this one. It's from a girl in Seattle." The letter described a struggling neighborhood where an old theater was about to be demolished. The young writer, inspired by Emma's bookshop story, had started a campaign to transform it into a community cultural center. Victoria, who had been coordinating with the Richardson Sterling Literary Trust's new projects, immediately recognized the opportunity. This is exactly the kind of initiative the Story Keepers program was designed for. Richard entered from the Rare Books Room, where he'd been cataloging a new collection of first editions. These days, his business acumen was entirely focused on preserving literary heritage and supporting community projects. "I think it's time we took Story Keepers on the road," he suggested. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been experimenting with new literary-themed recipes in her cafe, joined the conversation. "Every place has its own flavor," she said wisely, "just like every story has its own spice." The cafe had become famous for its book-paired menu items. Today's special was Adventure's First Bite. Pastries designed to complement different genres of books. Mystery readers enjoyed dark chocolate surprises, while romance enthusiasts discovered heart-shaped treats filled with raspberry cream. Mr. Chen arrived with exciting news about the Seattle project. "The local historical society is interested in partnering with us," he reported. "They see the potential for cultural preservation through storytelling." Sophie had already opened her project notebook to a fresh page titled Story Keepers Seattle Chapter. Her vision for the program had evolved into something more comprehensive than anyone had initially imagined. "It's not just about saving buildings," she explained, sketching out her ideas. "It's about helping communities discover their own stories, like how the theater in Seattle probably holds thousands of memories just waiting to be shared and celebrated." Emma watched her daughter with pride as Sophie outlined a plan that went beyond mere preservation. The Story Keepers program would help communities document their local histories, establish writing programs for all ages, and create spaces where new stories could take root. "We should start with oral history projects," Sophie suggested. "Let people share their memories of the theater, just like we did with the bookshop. Then we can help them imagine its future." Victoria, who had been taking notes on her tablet, looked up with excitement. "What if we created a network? Connected All these story-keeper sites so they could share resources and inspiration? The idea sparked immediate enthusiasm. Richard began calculating how the trust could support such an initiative, while Mr. Chen considered the legal framework needed to protect each site's unique character. Mrs. Rodriguez disappeared into her kitchen, returning moments later with a fresh batch of her famous hot chocolate. "For inspiration," she said, distributing cups to everyone. "Every good plan needs sweetness to help it grow." As they sipped their drinks, Sophie continued sharing her vision. Each Story Keeper's site would maintain its own identity while being part of a larger narrative of community renewal. The Seattle Theater might become a performance space for spoken word poetry and dramatic readings, while other sites might focus on different aspects of storytelling. "And look at this," Sophie said, pulling out more letters. "There's a closed library in Boston, a shuttered printing house in Chicago, an old bookbinder's workshop in New Orleans, all places with stories waiting to be remembered and renewed." The copper bell chimed as a group of young writers arrived for their weekly workshop. Sophie's original writing program had grown into a comprehensive youth literacy initiative, with participants now serving as mentors for new members. "You know what this means?" Emma asked, watching the young writers settle into their favorite spots around the shop. "Your great-grandmother's dream didn't just come full circle, it's creating new circles everywhere it goes." Sophie smiled, adding another note to her project book. "Stories are like rings in a pond. Each one creates ripples that touch other stories until the whole world is connected by waves of words and wonder." Through the window, spring sunlight illuminated the busy street outside. Bookshop Row had become a model for cultural districts across the country, proving that literature could be a catalyst for community revival. But more than that, it had become a testament to the power of believing in stories, both the ones written in books and the ones written in hearts. The preparations for the first Story Keepers National Conference transformed Emma's bookshop into a hub of excited activity. Representatives from different cities would be arriving soon, each bringing their own tales of community renewal and literary preservation. Sophie had taken charge of organizing the youth panel, where young writers from around the country would share their visions for the future of storytelling. Her project notebook had expanded into multiple volumes, each filled with ideas, observations, and plans for connecting communities through their stories. "The Seattle team just landed," Victoria announced, checking her phone. "Their youth theater group is already asking about collaboration opportunities with our writing program." Richard, who had been setting up the conference registration area in the cafe, looked up with a smile. "Remember when we thought success was about competing? Now it's all about connecting." Mrs. Rodriguez had outdone herself preparing for the conference. She'd created a special menu featuring dishes inspired by each participating city's literary heritage. Seattle's Rainy Day Revelations, a warming soup served with story-shaped crackers, was already drawing attention from early arrivals. "Food connects people just like stories do," she explained, arranging fresh pastries on display. "Each bite tells a tale of where we come from and who we hope to be." Emma found herself in the writer's sanctuary, now expanded to accommodate the growing community of authors who called the bookshop home. The walls were lined with photographs from other Story Keepers sites, the Seattle Theater's Art Deco facade, the Boston Library's classical columns, the New Orleans Workshop's historic storefront. "It's amazing how each place has its own character," Mr. Chen observed, joining her. "Yet they're all connected by the same spirit of renewal." Sophie burst in, excitement radiating from her small frame. "The Chicago team just sent their presentation. They've turned their old printing house into a multimedia storytelling center. They're teaching kids how to combine traditional bookmaking with digital storytelling." The copper bell chimed continuously as more conference attendees arrived, each bringing energy and ideas to share. The bookshop hummed with multiple languages, different accents, and varied storytelling traditions, all mixing together in a celebration of narrative diversity. Victoria gathered everyone in the main room for the opening session. The space had been arranged to encourage conversation, with comfortable seating areas clustered around theme-based discussion pods. At the center stood a simple display, the original journal of Emma's grandmother, opened to her prescient words about the power of stories to connect communities. "Before we begin," Sophie announced, stepping to the front, "I want to share something I've been working on. It's called the Story Keeper's Manifesto." The room fell silent as Sophie opened her notebook. Even those who had witnessed her wisdom before leaned forward, eager to hear her latest insights. "We believe," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner, "that every community has a story worth telling, that every building holds memories waiting to be shared, that every person carries a narrative that deserves to be heard. We believe in the power of words to bridge divides, heal wounds, and build futures. We believe that stories are not just entertainment. They are the threads that weave communities together, the foundations upon which understanding is built, the seeds from which new possibilities grow. As story keepers, we commit to preserving not just buildings and books, but the spirit of storytelling itself. We promise to create spaces where all voices can be heard, where all tales can find their audience, where all dreams can take root and grow. We understand that our work is not just about the past. It's about creating futures where stories continue to connect, inspire, and transform, where every community can discover its own voice and add it to the grand narrative of human experience." As Sophie's words settled over the assembled crowd, Emma felt tears in her eyes. Victoria squeezed her hand, while Richard nodded approvingly. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes with her apron, and Mr. Chen furiously took notes. Through the windows, spring sunshine illuminated the busy street outside, where more conference attendees were arriving. Each person carried not just their luggage, but their community's hopes and dreams, ready to be shared and woven into the growing tapestry of the Story Keepers movement. "And remember," Sophie concluded, her young voice filled with timeless wisdom, "every story we save, every voice we amplify, every community we help rebuild becomes part of something bigger, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. Through narrative." The copper bell chimed once more, its clear tone seeming to seal Sophie's words like a promise. The Story Keepers Conference was about to begin, marking another chapter in the ever-expanding story of how one bookshop's revival had sparked a movement of literary renewal across the nation.